And so it was the question of taxation without representation that drove the Magna Carta into existence. Now, they say the same thing about America, but by the time that we get to America, it was even beyond having no vote. The colonies had no vote in England.
That's what started the revolution, right?
Well, yes and no, because that's what they point to in history. That's what everybody tells you. But if you actually look at what was happening, you have a situation where the colonies really didn't give a crap about what England was saying.
Right.
They were doing very well. They had they were printing their own money. There was, England was over there and they did, nobody bothered with them. But then, because the Americas were getting so, very economically powerful, the British decided that, when you get to the top echelon of military, the only way that you can win is if you can be economically superior. Any military, strategy planner will tell you have to have the economy to be able to field the military. So when the British are looking at what's happening over in America, they're going, we have no economic control over them.
But didn't that have to do with the fact that we did have our own monetary system, or were working towards it and taking it away from, well, they didn't call it the World Bank then, but.
Well, that's exactly what it was. It was, the local people were making their own money. And, then the people next door would say, well, so we can trade, let's just have this, the same money too. And so they had built, because of need, an economic currency that was being, used throughout the colonies. So what they did in Britain is that the Parliament put out a law that said that the colonists could no longer print their own money. Now, it's interesting to me that how that sort of like psychologically, why did they agree to that? They should have right then and there said, no, we're not going to do this. I've never quite studied, maybe the information is there or maybe it isn't, why they would have agreed to this stipulation that you have to use the money that is being produced and printed by the English bank. Okay? Without that, no commerce was allowed. You had to have that money. So the economy immediately started to crash, because now it wasn't just the colonies, the internal colonies, it was also their relationship to foreign countries. They had to use the king's money in order to do it. So it wasn't the taxes that they had no representation of. It was everything. But they did raise the taxes, but the taxes had to be paid by the British money. And they didn't have any British money. They couldn't get the British money here. It's on the other side of the world,
Mm-hmm.
Ocean. So everything just started cascading because of this insane, wanting to control from the outside any economy. It never works. And that's exactly what happened in the common market that the European Union grew out of in order to try to control it. But within the context of this movie, they went back to World War I to show how Britain was, at that point in the game, the primary example of control from the top. Because during World War I, yes, you were in a crisis situation and you had to have some kind of a central control to maintain a semblance of society. So they started regulating the food, regulating the transportation, regulating. So the war ends and, the Magna Carta concept of, that the English people are sovereign, that the people are sovereign, okay, was already being eroded by this concept of, well, in a war situation, you have to take control from the top because the people can't do it by themselves. So that mentality crept in, and a lot of the regulations just stayed after World War I. Then World War II comes along, and those regulations that had been, reneged on, pulled, denied or whatever, they came right back, and then more stuff was on top of that. And again, they're using it for crisis management. So you can't really argue against it. But at the end of the war, they had so many regulations within the, United Kingdom and the economic environment of it that it was really holding everything down again. Nothing was working. In the 1800s, the 19th century, Britain was the absolute best at creating industry. There was all sorts of brilliant people doing brilliant things, and competition was what drove everything. If you couldn't succeed, you didn't succeed. So only the really powerful forces of the economy that the people needed were working. But as soon as you start planning from the top and putting regulations and then suppressing the innovative, what do they call them?
Incentives?
No, the adventurer, entrepreneur. Okay. When you start to put them down, that entrepreneurship, that's not there anymore. It's being driven out.
Like now.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that was why I'm telling this story, because it was about Britain and it's about the EU, but the control mechanisms and how it happened, I'm going like, oh my God, that's exactly what happened over here.
Mm-hmm. No, that's because we largely are, our whole system of government, our whole system of doing things, corporation-wise, business-wise, are exactly the same. I mean, it's the same kettle of fish, that run everything. And it's not just here and over there. I think it's, everywhere. And growing and growing and growing because of, we go in and take over everything, everywhere we go. And it's not, people have a tendency to see us and Britain as separate, but in reality we're not. It's the same old, same old.
It does seem that way. It does seem that way. And one of the things that he mentioned that I was like, oh wow, yeah, is that during World War II and then in the aftermath, but primarily during the war, there was a philosophy that came out that said the company is a national asset. The corporation. In other words, before the wars, a company is a company and, they're doing their thing. But when you're in a war situation, all of a sudden, the company becomes a national asset. You have to be able to have that forgery working. And so now the corporations took a higher spot on the importance list than the people themselves.
Mm-hmm.
The individual was no longer part of the mesh. That's what those wars did to us. They really psychologically screwed us over. So then they were talking about all this that happened in Britain, and that, when I was studying at the universities and stuff, history, especially studying European history, one of the things that I came away with was the fact that, Germany had been completely destroyed, and yet Germany had grown incredibly powerful. In 20 years, Germany went from a country if you look at the pictures, everything was on the ground. I don't even know where the people were staying. All the factories gone, all the bombing that they did destroyed that country. So, but in 20 years, they went from total destruction to being the third most powerful economic country in the world.
Well, not only the buildings were destroyed, but they were made to pay for the war.
No, actually, no, that was World War I. World War I, they were supposed to pay for the war. But I don't think that happened in World War II, and I'll tell you why. because there has never been a peace treaty of World War II. There is an armistice. There was never a sit down, okay, you owe us this, we owe you that. It never happened. There is no, end to World War II. There's simply been an armistice.
Well, now that's quite interesting.
Isn't it? And you guys can fact check me on this. It's not like I haven't had erroneous facts before, but this is what I know. So after World War I, that was one of the reasons that, the Depression actually started in many weird ways. It was this continual drain on the German people. Everything, a wheelbarrow at that point, wouldn't buy you a loaf of bread. The inflation that happened and all of this, but that was World War I. And then, yes, it did set up a lot of things for World War II. But after World War II, what happened to Germany was that, the U.S. instituted the Marshall Plan, which was to build Germany back up. And I came away with learning that even though Britain had won the war, they had lost the years after that because the Marshall Plan had put the money into rebuilding the factories in Germany. So in England, they had worn out factories, maybe war damaged, whereas in Germany, they get this new stuff from the Marshall Plan. Well, interestingly enough, in this this video, that wasn't what happened. And I had not picked this up, and I was, I went to college for this stuff. What really happened was a guy by the name of Erhard became the economic minister of Germany after World War II. The place was in ruins. So the British are there telling him, well, you gotta put all these regulations and you gotta do this and you gotta do that. And he said, no, I don't have to do any of that. And he completely took down all of the regulations that the German government, Nazi or otherwise, had in place. And because he did that, it opened up the entrepreneur movement within Germany. And of course that brought in money, that people had because they'd made so damn much money during the war, to invest in Germany. So the thing that they didn't want anybody in college to come away with was the idea that if you simply eradicate any economic controls, the economy will come back. That's what they didn't want anybody to know. That's what they didn't teach me. But by God, that's exactly what happened. They told me it was the Marshall Plan. Well, then this guy was telling how much money actually came from the Marshall Plan. It was nowhere near what they needed. But I was told, no, it was the Marshall Plan. America, was responsible for the buildup of Germany. Again, just, factual lies they like to tell us. But, so, Germany, on the other hand, is exactly what is acting like Great Britain did during the 1800s. And it works again. Leave them alone and they grow. So I say, within 20 years, you have a nation that was absolutely destroyed to being the third biggest economic country in the world. Britain on the other side, all these regulations, everything starts to come apart. So from the guy in the street, it comes down to, do you understand this? Or are you so focused on the details that you're not seeing the program? And that's why I agree with you, Colleen, that we don't know for sure what the percentage of people are that thought that they should get out. Because we only know what we were told is a 51-49 tally that was never recounted. And then Jan said that if they're doing it everywhere like she did it when she was there, they would actually count in the local districts the numbers. The votes weren't someplace else and then counted. They were actually counted right there where they were where the voting polls were. So let's assume that is a say, because they weren't using, now if they had voting machines, I have a different story here. But this is the old-fashioned kind of voting, unless they did voting machines, but I don't think they've got them in England. So even if we assume that it's a 51-49, some of the things that Jan had heard and Bill too were kind of like, oh, that's interesting. One of them was that some people were saying, well, I voted to get out because it was a protest vote. I didn't actually think that it was going to happen, and other people are going like, oh, I didn't understand that that's what that meant. Because what's happening is that all this money that the EU is putting in these different organizations, okay, those people are coming out and saying, oh, we need the EU. We need the EU. Well, they do, because they get money from the EU. So those people that are saying we need the EU gets into the mainstream media thing. And suddenly even the people that voted against it are getting nervous. So you have to look at this and you have to kind of say like, these have to be some of the common elements in any nation's voting, well, let's just say Britain and the United States. I can see the same things happening over here.
Definitely. I mean, there's a lot of things that they want you to vote for, and they give they're not really even talking points. Okay, this is why you need this. This is why you don't need this. I mean, they don't do it that way. It's so much rhetoric. They talk a lot about issues without talking about the issues. So people hear this on their television station, or they read this stuff in the paper, if anybody's actually watching the news, and they get these ideas, these feelings in their heads about all this stuff, but they really don't know why they should be for it or why they should be against it or any of that kind of stuff. And two, there's a lot of things that when you go up to vote, there's these extra things on the bottom of the ballot, do you want blah, 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 blah. And you've not even heard them talk about any of this stuff before. And people just check a mark or whatever they do and don't realize the ramifications of it, because some of it's worded trickily. Are you for this? Are you against it? But maybe the referendum is against it, and so you're for it being against it, and it's really confusing. Well, plus then there's also the issues that I've seen on these old kind of votes, is that in Scotland, for instance, last year I believe it was, there were stacks and stacks and stacks of votes that were put in the wrong pile. So when you go to count them, you're counting it, say, as a for when it really was an against kind of thing. And they've also found stacks of votes hidden away. So I don't know how one would go about, okay, you're counting the votes, but is anybody watching over how you're counting them?
I never thought about that even though Jan was saying they were counting the votes right there in the precinct, if you had somebody that wanted to screw things up, they would just change the piles. Oh, no, we'll put these guys over here because this is what we want to happen.
Right, because then they showed the tables of these are supposed to be the for votes and these are the against votes. And they're wrapped, in so many to a bundle. But then when they started examining the tables, there was an awful lot of one placed on another. Now, you can say that's by mistake. Oh, I put them on the wrong table. I do that sometimes. But when you're talking hundreds and hundreds of votes, maybe it's not such a mistake.
Well, now they've got, or they're working to try to get this whole thing done again, because of inconsistency. I don't know what it is, but according to Jan, they actually had enough signatures to be able to force this to be considered by the parliament. But what I'm hoping is that with all this hullabaloo about everything, that those people that did not vote the first time, because they're sitting there saying there's no way that this is ever going to happen. They'll manipulate the voting. It's not going to happen. Maybe those people will then get off their asses and go vote. And it could be even a worse
scenario. Yeah, I'm thinking if they didn't vote the first time, they shouldn't be able to vote the second time.
Oh, come on.
For real. Well, because then you can, okay, all these people didn't vote because they figured it wasn't going to go through, so you give them a chance then to change the vote. And I suppose if the people wanted things to change, they'd have gotten out to vote.
No, not if you don't think it's going to matter.
I think that when they didn't vote, they kind of lost their chance. That's my way of thinking about it. Unless you ensure that every single person who's allowed to vote does vote, and I'm not seeing that happening. Especially over here.
Yeah, especially over here. But it opens up, what's his face? Fulford. Let me see what he was saying, because, again, I was hoping to talk to Walt about this. He remembers this stuff better than I do. Okay. What he's saying is that, whatever's happened over in Britain is basically an example that it can be done. And he's absolutely sure that Greece will exit the EU. And then he's talking about Italy. And let's see, he says, the other EU country where a crisis is quickly coming to a head is Italy. There, the Prime Minister promised a 150 billion euro government bailout for Italian banks, only to be publicly scolded by the Germans, who said no such deal because they would end up paying for it. The Germans would end up paying for it. The Italians then told the Germans it was up to the Italians to decide. This degenerated into a public spat that is likely to end up with Italy reverting to something, resigning. CIA forces in Europe stay. But again, this whole thing is causing even more and more turmoil in the various states. He's saying that France will also be forced by financial reality to leave the euro and revert to the franc. Austria's highest court ruled last week that the recipient presidential election held there was marred, the recent presidential election held there was marred by fraud and needed to be held again. Clearly, the EU project envisioned as evolving into a Soviet Union-style world government is doomed. But that, the Soviet Union proved that it didn't work. The reason that they went down is that they kept trying to control the economy and 5-year plans being planned out by a group of think tankers who were saying, well, we need so many tractors and therefore so many tires and nobody wants the tractors. That's what brought them down economically, and this is exactly what the EU seems to be. Another weird thing that you may have heard about, because it was out there on Facebook, is Juncker, the EU Commission president, talking about meeting with leaders from other planets. Did you see that? Yeah. Let me see. It was weird. I looked at it. And let me just see what X-Politics is doing.
Well, how can they do that if they're denying that there's any such thing?
Well, according to Fulford, he might be drinking more. I don't know what that's all about. That's what he said. In a speech before the European Parliament discussing the consequences of the Brexit vote, the President of the European Commission, Jean-Claude Juncker, made the stunning comment that he had spoken about it to leaders of other planets Younker's comments suggest that world leaders are in communication with extraterrestrials, which closely monitor global events and assess their geopolitical and ex-political impact. His speech was given on June 28th at an emergency meeting in Brussels by the European Parliament. Here is what he said in French along with the English translation. So I'm going to read the English translation. It should be known that those who observe us from afar are very worried. I met and heard and listened to several of the leaders from other planets who are concerned because they question the path the European Union will engage on. And so a soothing is needed for both the Europeans and those who observe us from farther away.
Wow, now. I think perhaps he may have said some things he wasn't supposed to say, because I'm not aware of any government that I'm aware of, government actually coming out and even acknowledging the existence of UFOs and ETs, because it's all swamp gas, air, balloons, blah, blah, blah. And for somebody to say that they had met with them, is that all a part of disclosure?
Well, I don't know, because the official transcript released by the European Commission has been edited to remove the reference to leaders from other planets.
There you
go. The
go.
transcripts now read, I saw and heard and listened to several executives. They are very worried.
Mm-hmm.
Yet, when one listens to an audio loop of what Yonkers actually said, he very clearly includes the phrase, which translates leaders of other planets, as pointed out by native French speakers discussing his speech. There has been clearly an official attempt to cover up Younker's admission of having spoken to leaders of other planets and making it appear as though he was instead referring to executives concerned about the British exit. So what did Yonkers have in mind when he said he spoke to leaders of other planets? One possible interpretation is that he meant to say that he had spoken with other planetary leaders outside the European Union and made a simple grammatical error, as some contend. If so, then why wasn't the official transcript corrected to make it clear that he had misspoken? Furthermore, it is difficult to imagine a major world leader would make such a dramatic error in an important speech to the European Parliament without realizing it immediately and correcting that error on the spot. Also, at several points in his speech, he makes reference to himself as a human being and not a robot or a machine, suggesting that some in his intended audience are not human, as one native French speaker has noted in translating and interpreting his comments in a helpful thread on the Project Avalon forum. Taken on face value, Yucker's speech directly raises the issue that leaders of other planets or extraterrestrials are very concerned. It is worth exploring why this might be the case. There are two scenarios I wish to raise here. One is that the extraterrestrials require global unity as a precondition for revealing themselves to humanity or having their existence disclosed. If so, then the effect of BritX is one of slowing down the process of global political unification, therefore delaying any official announcement of extraterrestrial life. If the above scenario is correct, then what becomes important is whether the extraterrestrials are acting out a positive or negative intent in making global political unity a precondition for revealing themselves. While it appears logical that global political unity is required for any planet to be introduced to wider galactic life, as popularly depicted in many sci-fi shows, it does not follow that having a world government is necessary for open contact to happen. Here we need to distinguish between global government and global governance. Our planet may already have achieved sufficient global governance in terms of interlocking international treaties and institutions, thereby making global government a moot point. Nevertheless, if some extraterrestrials leaders genuinely desire global political unity before revealing themselves, then while BritX does slow the process down, it appears disingenuous for aliens to make this a precondition. Okay. And then it goes on and talks about, they can get really wordy. Well, let's just do it for heaven's sakes. Okay. Nevertheless, the second scenario is that the European Union is a sod for a Nazi Fourth Reich. Dolly, we're talking Nazis again. Which has secretly made alliances with a group of extraterrestrials called the Draconians. A retired aerospace engineer, William Tompkin, has provided documents supporting his claims that he participated in a covert U.S. Navy program with 29 spies in Nazi Germany who had discovered that the Third Reich had made secret agreements with the Draconians. And then there's a video here. I'll put that in the chat too. A result of the alien agreements led to the Nazis coming within a whisker of winning World War II, but had nevertheless been able to relocate much of their technology infrastructure to Antarctica before the war ended. This gave the breakaway Nazis the time they needed to achieve a decisive technological superiority over the U.S. military. Subsequently, the breakaway Nazi group established a Fourth Reich through covert economic means, which involved both the infiltration of the U.S. military-industrial complex and the creation of the European Union. In such a scenario, BritX is a clear challenge to the Fourth Reich. There are other scenarios that may help explain why leaders of the world are concerned, and why Yuckers chose the European Parliament as the forum to leak this information. Most EU parliamentarians are not part of the official loop on what would clearly be highly classified discussions with advanced alien civilizations. Yet Yuckers chose to reveal this to them. Why? Many will be tempted to dismiss Yuckers' admission of having spoken with extraterrestrials as him simply misspeaking about confidential discussions with other world leaders. However, the clumsy attempt by the EU Commission to remove the leaders of other worlds reference from the official transcript of his speech, no effort to clarify his real intent in the transcript, and overall context of his speech suggests otherwise. His speech needs to be taken at face value and therefore provides startling evidence that we are moving from a world of geopolitics to exopolitics requiring new level of analysis and understanding major political events on our planet and the existence of extraterrestrial life. So there you go. Interesting. And the Nazis got back. Well, everybody knew that the EU was really, a continuation of documents the Nazis drew up before World War II. So, anyway, we're at way over the top, 3 minutes over the top of the hour. So, let's take a break. And anybody that feels like they want to jump in here, please. We'd love to have you.
Okay, I'm gonna put on an oldie, Nights in White Satin by the Moody Blues.